Okay, so to begin with this setup, we're going to add in a XP system. Now this is quite a simple setup, there's not a whole lot to it, but it still kind of always shocked me that there isn't actually a single tutorial kind of detailing how to create a simple flip tank setup like this in X Particles. So what we're going to do is drop in a cube, and I'm just going to kind of turn off my work plane here and my world axis. And with the cube selected, we'll do Shift C and we'll type in display, we'll get display tag. And we will check the use box and just change that to lines. Now if we press F2 and come to that top view, and then I'm going to do Shift S and just make sure that grid/work plane snap is on there. And I'm just going to kind of drag this out to some sort of aspect ratio, kind of keeping it in line there with the grid so we can get whole parameters here. I think something maybe a bit smaller like this will do. And if we press F3 and come down and make this a little bit smaller here as well. In fact, we can even shrink this even more and just align it just like that. And I'm just going to make it a little bit smaller. Okay, now we've kind of got this 16:9 type aspect ratio box. What we're going to do is we're going to change the XP emitter here to object. And then what we're going to do is change it to the cube. And if we hit play, you're going to see it kind of shooting out the middle of each face. And we don't want that, so we're going to change the emit from to object volume. And now if we hit play, you'll see them spawning in the middle, but kind of shooting outside the boundaries. If you didn't want to do a flip tank setup, if you were to just add an XP collider and change that to inside on the cube itself, now they would kind of be bashing against the sides and not escaping. But we're going to do that today, but in a slightly different way. So if we come to dynamics, underneath choose dynamics, we're going to add a XP fluid flip. You're going to see it's going to drop in this massive blue cube. And if we hit play, we're going to see that everything within that blue cube is going to obey the flip dynamics. Everything outside is not. So you can kind of imagine what we're going to do right now. We're going to make this similar and turn off snapping. That was Shift S. We're going to make this similar proportions to the cube we've created. We want it to be a little bit bigger, but not too much bigger. To be resting close to the bottom, and we want it to be roughly about half the size. If it's too big, when we hit play, all the particles are just kind of drop to the bottom, and it wastes it can waste up to a few seconds of getting on with that. So we want to minimize that as much as possible. So what we want is just it kind of being a little bit bigger on each kind of proportion and axis than the box itself. And then if we hit play now, we're going to see them kind of fly around everywhere. It's not going to look that much different. That's because if we come to modifiers, we're going to drop in a gravity, and now it's really going to start kind of getting the look we want. But it's emitting at a rate, they're coming in constantly, we don't want that. So we're going to change the emission to shot, and I'm going to just change that to 100,000. And now if we hit play, we get them all spawning in, they're kind of flopping around a little bit, they're kind of acting like water, which is what we want. And they're just they're going to sit there, and they're not going to do much. They're maybe going to move around slightly. I'm going to change my amount of frames here to 300. And well, we're kind of in the territory now of having a decent flip setup, and we're just going to amplify this, mess with it, add some complexities to it, see what we can do to create a more kind of advanced look. So the first thing we can do is go to modifiers, come back to motion modifiers, add in a turbulence, can maybe set this to 20, set the scale to about 80, set the frequency to about 90, hit play. Now we're gonna get everything moving around a little bit. This is nice. But a couple things and a couple of parameters I want to go over regarding the particles obeying the flip. So for example, the radius here, I want you to think of this more as the space in between the particles. So if I decrease this down to 1 and hit play, you're going to see they're going to slam more to the bottom, but it's going to create more detail. So you can kind of leverage this to create more detail. However, if we come to the display and we change this to gradient parameter and set it to fluid density / velocity, there's going to be a really good way to visualize the particles and kind of see what's going on a little bit. If if I press F2 and I hit play, you're going to see a lot of geeking out, a lot of like, it almost looks like lightning. Looks very weird. Kind of along the bottom. You can't always see it. I'm going to come up to 3 there. You can see a little bit kind of going on there. If I increase the shot count, 200,000, see if we can see it. Doesn't seem to be too bad. But there's a general rule of thumb here, is the lower we bring these particles, bring up the radius count with it. This is going to kind of stop that geeking out from happening when you're visualizing the particles themselves. But also I've just found it helps them behave a little bit more if you do want to bring them all down, and it helps it kind of keep its density as well. If you bring it down too much on a lower amount of particles, for example 50,000, it's going to flatten out too much. It's just not going to look that nice. So for now I'm going to keep this at 2, and I'm going to do about 250,000 particles, and that should be a relatively nice amount. I'll probably come back to these parameters, but just for viewport playback, I'm going to keep it close to 100. You can see we're kind of getting that sparking and lightning underneath. It seems to clear up a little bit as we progress into the simulation. But yeah, you can really see that there. So if I wanted to avoid that, if I just brought this up to about 5, it would completely get rid of it. So as we come up, I'll keep this at about 5 just now, but later on, or maybe 4. A bit later on, you'll see me bring the shot count way up to about 350, 400,000, maybe higher. And with that, that'll allocate me the ability to bring this radius way down and decrease the space between all the particles. Now what we want to move on to doing is adding in a couple more modifiers, and then through that, we're kind of going to set up a collider. I'll show you how to mess with that. And then we'll move on to rendering these in Octane. Now, adding detail to a simulation like this, there's a couple kind of ways we can go about it. Of course, changing and creating multiple sizes of the particles. And here's kind of the big thing here is Xparticles by default doesn't add rotation parameters to the individual particles. Programs like Houdini do tend to do this. Xparticles doesn't. I'm guessing because it's within Cinema, and Cinema is a little bit slow sometimes. So they don't have it in because it's going to slow down the simulation a little bit. I can't say I really notice it on my system, but they say that it does. So we have to add that manually. And if you're just planning to render out these particles as spheres, just a sphere object, I wouldn't worry about this. But the way I'm going to show you how to do this today is we'll do it with some Megascan rocks, for example, and that's going to create a pretty interesting look. But if we don't add in these rotation parameters, if I drop in a cube here, scale it down, and you imagine that I'm using this cube as I'm going to use the rocks later on to visualize all the particles and render them out. If we don't add in these rotation parameters, it's just every rock is going to hold the same rotation parameters and kind of move around like this. Whereas, of course, when they're moving, we want them to kind of like rotate as they're moving in different ways and stuff. So the first way we can do this is if we come to extended data and we just hit under general data, we hit use rotation and we change this to tangential. Underneath simple spin, you can add in a spin amount. I'm not going to do this right here though, because here's where it gets a little bit tricky, is when we cache this, and if we were to retime it, which I generally like to do with these simulations, I did it in my last Xparticles tutorial. I may or may not do it in this tutorial, I'm unsure yet, most likely. But when it comes to doing that, these rotation parameters here will completely disobey the cache and the retiming. So if we have these particles come in really quick and then slow down after about 20 frames, this spin isn't going to obey that, and they're just going to keep spinning at whatever speed you've got them set to. So the way we get around that is by adding in a motion modifier, that being the XP spin. And what we do is we set in something really small, 0.1 by 0.1 by 0.1. That should be enough. In fact, you could even come lower. I think I'm going to switch scenes quickly and check. I just went and checked another scene to make sure, because I wasn't sure if it was actually like 0.01. I did a lot of testing and rendering out and just kind of seeing the particles endlessly flying around at like insane speeds. And I did find that these really low values here are the best. So we're going to stick with that. And now when we eventually render out the rocks, they should be spinning and they should be at a decent speed as well, and they will retime. Now, after that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to rename the emitter particle or in fact small underscore p. And I'm going to add extra detail to this simulation. I'm going to quickly save the scene. So I'm going to add extra detail to the scene here by adding another emitter. Sorry. And we're going to name this large underscore p. And then what we're going to do with this, if you want to just come to the basic object here, it's under display, that's it. And we'll change this to pink. And we'll leave that as blue. And yep. And then we're going to change the display mode here to single color, and we'll make it that same pink. And what we're going to do is drop the amount of the shot count here to 10,000. So now if I go and I hit play, we're going to see we've got these little pink particles sitting in the middle. I'm going to help kind of visualize this by changing this back to single color and keep that on blue. And now in the middle we have the pink particles. I'll make them a little bit larger. And I'm just going to come back to that parameter because it actually looks really flat. And for God's sake, I'm going to change it to spheres. Now we hit play. You can see we've got these particles in here. Now, what's going to be cool about this is when I add in the mega scans, if I then add, of course, we'll have to go into for the Octane object tag to see the particles in Octane. I'll add a second rock and we'll make it larger, and that will add a little bit of detail. Now, why would we do that as opposed to adding an Octane object tag and just adding an extra piece of geo in here? And that's because what we're doing is getting way more control over the large ones that we want, the amount that we want, or even if we want to go deep and mess with the modifiers, add in multiple spin modifiers, and then have them kind of corresponding. It's most likely that the large rocks would probably spin a little bit slower. You could go to that level of detail if you wanted. We could even add in another one, call it X large underscore P. You know, change this to 1,000. Bring up that display massively. Make it green. And you know, now you could have like even bigger ones in there. So this is going to be a way to kind of control that. And I'm just going to stick with the 2. And it's going to be quite a nice setup. But yeah, of course, if you wanted to, you could add in 3 pieces of geometry under your main particles and kind of give them slightly different scales, or 3 duplicates of the same geometry, give them, you know, different scale values, and then, you know, that will do the job for you. But I kind of like to have the control of having big particles, small particles, and then going in and messing with them individually. Now, if we want to add in a collider and have them all kind of move around an object, let's add in a cylinder. We'll make it about 110 on the radius. If we press, come back to F1 here, and then we're going to scale this way through the particle tank. And I'm going to do the same thing with the display tag, and I'm going to turn it off just now. Yeah, I'm going to turn it off. Come back up to the top. We'll right click, Insidium tags, XP collider. What's going to happen? You're going to get a bunch of particles sitting around in the middle. It's not going to look good. Really easy fix. You just come to your fluid flip, solver, solid objects, accurate collisions. Now, if you're using more advanced geometry when creating a collider like this, for example, a megascan, if you want them all to go flying around a giant rock or a tree, make sure there's no polygon holes. If there's holes anywhere in your geometry, or if there's, you know, it's not closed at the bottom, it's a tree trunk and it's not closed at the bottom, these parameters won't help you. It will, in fact, it won't even look like this. It will just like really geek out, not look cool at all. So pay attention if you're not using parametric objects, you're bringing in models you've made yourself or scans or something. Make sure there's no holes there, otherwise it will really freak out. So if we hit play now, we're going to see they obey that and they all kind of flow around it, and it looks nice. And we could do this with as many objects as we want, just like that. Okay, so I've kind of shown you the basics of setting up a flip tank. I'm not really going to do much else now when it comes to kind of the X particle side of things. Most of our tweaks now are going to be in Octane. Like I said, this is a super simple setup. It's a shame there's not really been many tutorials in creating something like this. And we have a kind of simple water type setup with our particles. Now, one last thing is if you come into this fluid flip object, we can increase detail with the voxel size. I haven't really seen it to make as much as a difference. It does, but not as much of a difference as, for example, just increasing your shot count, decreasing the radius, messing with the turbulence. Things like that really seem to be amplifying how the simulation pans out a bit more. You know, you can really whack these particles around. If you're going to increase the strength of things, just bear in mind, if I do Control D, come to X particles, you might have to bring up your subframe steps as well, so it's kind of doing more calculations per frame for each particle. Of course, it's entirely up to you. I like to keep it quite simple. So there's not really much else in there, and we could also, it's probably better to change this to flip. As far as I'm aware, flip calculates better. So putting that as flip and leaving that like that, I think we're good to go into Octane. Now I'm just going to boot up Octane here. I was thinking just about what I said before about the voxel size not making a huge difference to the detail of the simulation. That's under the assumption that you're creating the particles the exact way I'm creating them here, by placing them in a box and then having them drop down. If you, for example, were to kind of do what we did in the last tutorial, where I had all the particles shoot out in one go out of a circle or you know, something in the middle there, and then have them reacting to the bounds this way just through the fluid flip, yeah, the voxel size would be something you want to tweak and mess with, especially kind of these parameters here. But in terms of just getting a nice kind of flowy tank, I don't think it's really something you need to mess with for this tutorial in particular, and the end result I'm going to try and get you to. So looking at Octane, you can see it's a little bit messed up. You know, the two basic things here is just because this bottom dot needs to go red on both of our collider and our cube. And then I'm just going to lock that screen there, change it to path tracing. We'll drop in a texture environment, make it black, go to objects, lights, area light, right click, animation tags, target the XP system. I'm going to bring the light out to the side, and then Shift C, Octane camera, and then make sure we enable that. Go to coordinates, and then hitting tab, I'm going to go 0, leave the Y, 0, 0, minus 90. And then I'm going to change the focal length to just 135 and zoom way up. Press F1 to get back into that main view and zoom way up above the tank. And now, underneath here, we've got these Octane tags just under the small particles. We're just going to enable that to geometry, and we're going to see it's going to start to render in everything. And then we're going to leave that like that. Kind of got our setup going. If I'm to hit play here, you'll kind of see it all moving, doing its thing, whatnot. Sorry. I'm just going to come over to Bridge. And, you know, I've got a lot of rocks and assets downloaded here. I'm not going to go mental kind of trying to find one. I think I've used this one before. I think the one I used most recently was this sandstone boulder. I'm going to drop that in and use that again. But first we need to just change our renderer up here in the render settings to Octane. I think I'm just going to use this one again. Nice, simple. I'm not really going to have to mess with the texture too much for the sake of the tutorial. But we'll add in a couple different ones anyway for the sake of detail. So I'm going to add that in. And first thing I'm going to do, scale that way down. And press F2 to go to the top view and move it way out of the way. And then in this geometry tag, I'm just going to drag that in. And in a second, you're going to see, well, I have to hit play and get some particles in. Keep doing that. It's the rock's way too small right now. I'm going to scale it back up a bit. Up quite a bit apparently. And I'm just going to change this. I'm going to press F3, use that right view, change it to perspective so I can move around while the viewport is still. I'm just going to scale up this light a bit, move it around to the top here. Move it up a bit. Okay, so we've got all these rocks everywhere. You can see they've got the rotation. It's looking nice. There's maybe a little bit too many around the bounding of this cylinder here. They're kind of bashing up against it. I'm going to increase those segments, but also just through adding variation in size, that will begin to look a little bit better. Now what we're going to do is we're going to add the same geometry Octane object tag to the large particles here, and what I'm going to do is call this small underscore rock, and we'll duplicate it, and we'll call this one large underscore rock. And now if we get rid of the small one out of here, drag in the large one, you can see for a second it showed us those larger particles, and we really just scale this up. You can see now we've got these nice kind of bigger ones sitting in there. I'm going to bring it down a little bit, bring down the small rocks a little bit, bring the scale of everything down. And now what I'm going to do is just add in another rock. So if we come back to bridge, and I've kind of got this small sandstone one sitting there, but I'm going to use this tundra rock down here. Now this is all stuff I've downloaded. Again, you might have to spend a bit of time looking for the assets you want to use. But for the sake of the tutorial, I'm just dropping in ones that kind of have a coherent look to them. And just double click that material, fixes it, and we'll scale it way down to about 5%, bring it over to the side, and in that small p, I'm just going to drop it in there. Remember to hit play. And you can see this one's very big, so I need to scale that down even more. I want it to just be sitting in there, being a little bit smaller, just adding some extra detail. Okay, now what are we going to do next? I'm going to scale these big ones down a little bit more, and I'm going to let the simulation play out for a second, and I'm going to increase maybe the scale here and the strength. And I'm going to let the simulation play through and get a little bit of turbulence going on. Right now, everything looks a little bit flat. I don't really want that. I'm just going to play up here to about 60 frames or so. Yeah, everything going mental. Okay. Now if we look at this, okay, looks cool. So in the Octane object, the Octane light, I'm going to change the power to 1000, and in the distribution, add a fall off map, set it to 90 degrees, change the sampling rate to 3000, press F3 to come back to that view, press W to get your world axis, and I'm going to drag this back, up, and then I'm going to duplicate the Octane sky, change it to visible, and then back in the primary one, I'm going to lift up the shadows quite a bit, because it was quite dark, and then bring in the camera here, and you know, now we're getting somewhere. It's beginning to look quite cool. Maybe gonna, sorry again for tweaking so much, I know it's annoying, but maybe just bring up the large ones once again, and you could add a second light, you could add a bunch of things. What I'm gonna do next though is come into the materials and give them a bit more saturation. Sort out all of these nodes. I'm just going to add in a bit of saturation there, make it a bit more orange, bring down the gamma a little bit, and then in this tundra stone, do the same thing, more saturation. Okay, I was just bumping up the saturation a bunch there to kind of get locale of where they are, because they're a little bit hard to notice right now. Just bring up the gamma. Just get a more kind of orangey look in there. I'm going to come back to that first one. and do the same thing again here. You can see some of these in there are still looking quite brown. Bump up the saturation. I think that is the tundra stone still. Yeah. Okay. Right. That looks cool. Bit more color in there. Popping a little bit. In the camera imager, enable the camera imager. Bring up the highlight compression. And we'll give it a little bit of bloom. Not much though. And in terms of visualization, probably not going to really change that much now. One thing we could do though, and I think this looks really cool, is if we come to modifiers, we could add in a XP wind. And then if you just rotate that, for example, 90 degrees, and let it play out, and get this like super awesome kind of like flowing animation of it all kind of like falling and hitting the bottom. That looks really cool. So, you know, a couple different kind of modifiers we could add here. And bump up that wind strength. Really get them flying down. You get this cool build up at the bottom, and if you have a high enough tank, they'll splash back over. And render on that. Yeah. So one thing I'm going to do now, I did tell you I was going to come and do this. I'm going to bring down the radius to 2, and I'm going to bring this up to 350,000. I'm going to leave the large at the same. I want that to stay around 10,000, and I'm going to hit play. It's going to be quite a bit slower. And let this come up to about 50 frames or so. And now if we hit render on that, you might not notice a humongous difference, although the particles themselves are going to appear a bit smaller, but one thing you're going to see is that there's going to be way more of them. So now we have to kind of counter that with the scale. Of course, this one has remained the same. We just bring up that small rock back to kind of its original scale that we had before on it. Bring up this other tundra rock. That one is quite a bit darker, isn't it? I'm going to try and lighten that up more. And we've lost a little bit of contrast, so yeah, that's fine. Maybe scale these up a bit more, yeah. Right, so of course that comes back to full circle to what I said earlier about increasing the amount of detail there. I'm gonna add a second camera. Kind of see this from a different point of view. You can even get something kind of swirling around there. Now, the last thing I'll do, I did this in the last tutorial, but I'm going to do it again, is we'll just cache the simulation and do a nice little retime on it, and you can kind of see some of the motion modifiers in action. So I'm going to leave Octane open, but if we just come to utilities, and we'll add in a XP cache. Now I'll just specify where I want this, and then there's not really much else to it. We're just going to hit build cache, and we're going to wait on that. Okay, so once that's done caching, if you hit play, you will see your simulation going around really quickly. And what we can do is just come into the XP cache, same thing as the last tutorial, go to playback, retiming frame. We're going to put a keyframe on frame 0 and a keyframe on the very last frame. And what we're going to type in for this value is whatever our last frame is. So for me, it's 300. And now you're going to see if we play back through the animation, nothing happens. That's because this needs to be 0. And if we play back through it, it's playing just like normal. Now, let's say I want the first 20 frames to double, almost double in speed. Have them come up to about frame 45, and then we'll only use like the first couple seconds. So we'll say by the end of the animation, it only gets up to frame 90, so that's 3 seconds in. Now it'll come in really quick and then slow right down at frame 20. And you could keep messing with this. Frame 50, we could keyframe that to frame 50, and then between that and frame 70, this reaches frame 80, and then this comes in fast, slows down, and then speeds up a bit, and then slows way down. But it's going to be so slow now because between 80 and 90, so you maybe want to come up to like 120. Now if you hit play, we'll have fast bit, and then slows down again. So that's kind of simple retiming. One thing I would suggest as well is just change this and have it start on frame 1. Reason for this, or even maybe frame 2. Reason for this is just because when they're all kind of spawning in and they're all dropping down right at the start, it's kind of nice to just skip that and get that out of the way. Otherwise you're probably going to end up cutting those frames out in post. So just kind of get rid of them there. Get everything going super quick. We'll have a little look at that one last time in Octane. Awesome. So that's pretty much it. Not a whole lot else kind of going on here. Maybe we can clean up this scene. We can call it Geo. Call these cams. 1, 2. Got just one lights, and then BG, Sky, Collider, and what do we call this? Emitter. And then put them just pop them in the Geo folder and collect all these and call it scene. And there we go. Everything's nice and neat now. That's pretty much it. Not much else to creating these kind of flip tank setups. It's nice and simple. NX particles. It runs quite quick. It caches quite quick. You can see I'm using 350,000 particles. It's a decent amount. You could come up to millions if you want. Although it will get a little bit slow. I hope this tutorial helped you, and please tag me on Instagram if you create some of these kind of like awesome simulations. I love to see them. And you know, check out the store, check out my assets, my project files, and I'll be launching private coaching very soon, within the next couple of weeks. So feel free to contact me if you're interested in that ahead of time. And yeah, thank you for watching this tutorial, and I'll see you in the next one.